Well, good afternoon and welcome back to CWI Media, Committee for Workers International, CWI live stream weekly broadcasts. Of course, we give a general analysis of the coronavirus, of the crisis facing global capitalism. And of course, as always, we've seen an intensification of this crisis in the course of the last week or so globally. We've seen an incredible position unfold in the United States. We see the plunging of that country into an incredibly polarized situation in the run-up to the US presidential elections. We also see it ravaging in terms of the virus itself, re-emerging with greater ferocity in Europe and other countries, and we see a devastating position opening up in Latin America. And however, today, what we want to turn our attention to is developments in Southern Africa and how the crisis of capitalism is unfolding there. And of course, throughout Southern Africa, throughout Africa in general, we see a continent riven with corruption, with economic crisis, with a devastating position facing the working peoples, and a whole series of conflicts and wars developing in different countries, Ethiopia being one of the most recent. And today we're very privileged to have three comrades with us to discuss those particular developments. First of all, we have Bob Larby, a member of the International Secretariat of the CWI. We're privileged to have join us from Johannesburg in South Africa, Wiseman Hamilton, a veteran of the struggle for socialism in South Africa, a leading member of the Marxist Workers' Party, and also from Joburg as well. We're pleased to welcome Sean Arenda to join us today, also a member of the Marxist Workers' Party, to discuss some of these developments. We'd appeal to our viewers if they could go onto our YouTube channel, CWI Media, and subscribe to us there. It doesn't cost you anything to subscribe. You just have to tick the box because it will help us with our promotion of our broadcasts. Now, perhaps in terms of dealing with this discussion today, we could begin with Bob in London from the International Secretariat. We see many commentators have pointed in the past, in the recent period, to the prospects of a renaissance of Africa taking place. And Bob, maybe you could outline the general situation through the continent, through Southern Africa, and answer in particular, is there any real prospect of this devastating position being resolved within the framework of capitalism, and also outline a little bit what the current situation is in Africa itself?
Well, obviously, as you pointed out a moment ago, the impact of the COVID virus has been enormous in Africa. Just today, the charity Save the Children estimated that 70,000 children in Africa, in sub-Saharan Africa, will die from starvation this year because of the impact of the virus. And this is against a situation where, as you've said, the continent as a whole is deeply polarized. Much was said in the last few years about Africa rising. Different statistics were given to show that as a proportion, less Africans were living in poverty. But in fact, there's always with statistics, you can look at them in different ways. Because while the proportion of the inhabitants of sub-Saharan Africa living in poverty declined, the absolute numbers enormously increased over the last 20, 25 years. And what we're seeing in sub-Saharan Africa is a mixed development. Certainly there have been some changes. Obviously the development of technology, of mobile communications, the internet, that has transformed the situation in many countries. But overall, there has been no fundamental development. And we have a situation now where the virus is going to mean a dramatic drop in the sub-Saharan African economy. Also, there's a big drop of remittances, the money which is sent by friends and relatives outside Africa to their family and friends in Africa. That's been forecast to drop by nearly a quarter this year, all of which means that, as the World Bank said, in Africa, the poor will get poorer because of the virus. The United Nations estimates that 80 million Africans face extra poverty, face the possibility of extreme poverty this year. And this is against a background where, despite some of the technical developments, the vast majority of Africans still live on a hand-to-mouth basis. We take Africa as a whole, 85% of employment is in the so-called informal sector, which means it's day-to-day employment. It's not guaranteed employment. People without any form of work contracts or just living from day to day. And against that situation, the crisis means an enormous drop in living standards, with added to, obviously, the impact of the virus itself.
African continent in Mali is concerned. Sorry, was there a sound disconnection there? Sorry about that. I have myself on mute, actually. I mean, you gave some devastating figures there, Bob, in terms of the general position in Africa. But nevertheless, in the course of the past week or so, or just over a week, we've seen this military coup has taken place in Mali. And that seemed to be against the government, which had plunged itself into corruption, having come to power on the basis it was going to deal with the issue of corruption. And yet the military seems to have a degree of support amongst the population. So maybe you could amplify and explain what is going on there in Mali and what does it represent in terms of the processes at work.
Well, Mali is not the only country in Africa which has seen protests. In the last few weeks alone, if we look in North Africa, in Libya, Tunisia, there have been protests. At the same time, as we'll hear later, I'm sure, there have been movements in Southern Africa and also in Sudan. In the last few weeks, there have been protests against the governments in those countries. And what has happened in Mali is the result, first of all, of an ongoing crisis in that country, partly due, as you said, to the failure of the government, of the ousted government, to deliver on its promises, also because of the ongoing insurgency which is taking place in that country. And then finally, the icing on the cake, so to speak, was an attempt by the government to rig elections, which resulted in continuous protests. And it's against those protests that we saw the military coup of a couple of weeks ago. And certainly, as we've seen before in different African countries, these coups can sometimes be very popular. They can be very popular because they're seen as moving against a corrupt or a rotten, undemocratic regime. There can be different hopes that this coup will mark a different, a new future. But generally speaking, what we've seen when these coups have taken place, that in general, these hopes, if you like, have been dashed. These hopes have not taken place. And we can see it already developing in Mali, where it's not clear at all what the military leaders are planning to do. They've talked about sometime having elections, maybe in 3 years or so. At the same time, there's already tension developing between the military and the leaders of some of the protests which took place over the recent period. And a further background to what is happening in Mali is the fact that the major imperialist powers on a world scale are all in different ways intervening in different parts of Africa. And we see in Mali the intervention on the one hand of the United Nations with a large military force there, but in particular, we have the intervention of France, the former colonial power. And it's not clear at all. There's all sorts of rumors going around about different world powers intervening in the coup. Certainly, while, if you like, the ECOWAS and the African Union, that's the different international associations of African states, have condemned the coup, mainly because the civilian rulers of the different African states themselves don't want to face a military coup. So that is why they're condemning it. They condemn it as being undemocratic, even though they themselves rig elections and run authoritarian regimes. They just don't want to be replaced at the point of a gun by the military. But from the point of view of the imperialist powers, there is maneuvering going on. Certainly, France is striving to develop and maintain its interest in Mali, as other rival powers are trying to as well. And therefore, the question is, facing the working people and the poor in Mali, is what is the way forward? And that, like we see in all these movements taking place in Africa, depends on them building their own forces, their own organizations, their own movements, and having a program which sees very clearly that they shouldn't go into collaboration with the military rulers, because that itself means that they're tied in to supporting the status quo, but on contrary, build a force, build a movement which is striving to fundamentally change society, which means, from the point of view of Mali and other countries in Africa, the question of who controls the resources of these countries, how can the resources be used to improve living standards and life for all, which fundamentally means breaking with capitalism. And that lesson, if you like, of previous movements, something which we see now in Sudan after the revolution there last year, where unfortunately the leaders of the movement in Sudan went into formed a coalition government with the military, which has not resulted in solving the fundamental problems, which is the reason why protests are continuing right now in Sudan. Those lessons need to be applied to ensure that, if you like, what has started in Mali ends in a really fundamental change and not just a cycle of military coups, brief periods of corrupt governments, and then new military coups.
No, that's a very important point in terms of just not falling into the trap of giving uncritical support to such military interventions. You mentioned about French imperialism intervening there, and they obviously seem to have their hands quite full at the present time because they're intervening in Mali. They're also dealing with Lebanon as well, plus the crisis in France. Now, you mentioned there, Bob, the question of South Africa, and maybe we could turn to South Africa now, to Wiseman, if you're there to join us from Johannesburg. Because obviously South Africa is a key regional player, a key regional power. It's the centre of gravity in many respects in Southern Africa itself. It's a country with very, very strong revolutionary traditions, with a powerful working class. The ANC in power seems to be riddled with corruption, like other African regimes as well. And yet there's a mass crisis developing, which is resulting in incredible developments of unemployment. But maybe, Wiseman, you could outline the general situation in South Africa and specifically address the issue, what is the ANC doing? And how is the ANC being perceived by the masses in South Africa at this stage? Wiseman, I think you need to unmute.
Sorry about that.
We're all doing it today.
Yes, just a word or two on the scale of the economic crisis. As you rightly point out, South Africa is the powerhouse of the Southern African continent, especially, and second on the continent in size, as far as economic stats are concerned, to Nigeria. And the pandemic has caused an economic disaster. The bourgeois economic journal, the Financial Mail, laid out the perspectives of the capitalist class for the economy going forward under the headline, Apocalypse Just Now. The majority of economists are deeply pessimistic over the economic prospects and the government's capacity to implement what they describe as the necessary reforms in order to overcome the crisis. There's a budget deficit that was predicted in the February budget would reach 6.8%, but now it's expected to reach 15% of GDP. The national debt was expected to reach 65.6% of GDP. It's going to 81%. The economy is headed towards a debt trap, a fiscal cliff, and a possible sovereign debt crisis. The economy has just completed the worst growth rate this past decade on record, at an average growth rate of 1.35%. The ANC entered that decade with a plan to raise the average growth rate to 5.4%, merely to stand still as far as unemployment is concerned. Under these circumstances, unemployment has ballooned. Before the pandemic began, it was 10 million. An additional 3 million people have lost their jobs. The World Bank says South Africa is facing its worst economic contraction this century and could collapse by as much as 8%. The approach of the government has been to place the burden of this crisis on the shoulders of the working class. The plans that the finance minister has put forward is for cuts of over 100 billion rand by 2021, further cuts of 230 billion rand by 2023, merely to stabilize the debt at 87%. Astonishingly, they want to return the budget situation to one of a primary surplus within a few years. The grounds, comrades, are being prepared for a massive social explosion. The government, in addition to the searing cuts that were introduced over the past 10 years, particularly since the 2008 financial crisis, has now thrown down the gauntlet to the working class itself. In the worst attack on the public sector workers in the post-apartheid period, the government has refused to implement the third leg of a salary agreement signed in 2018. In addition to this, the government is now confronted with a deluge of corruption. Ramaphosa came into office on the ticket of an anti-corruption buster. What has happened instead is that he's been compelled to place his personal spokesperson on compulsory leave as a result of the involvement of her husband in the exploitation of the pandemic with tenders that he won worth millions. It has caused outrage throughout the country. The hashtags that are going around show the anger, a volcanic anger that is beginning to build up. And it's already reflected in the protests that are taking place. As South Africa entered the pandemic, it was at the top of the World League of protests per head of population. Under the pandemic, the number of protests went up from 2.7 per day over the past 7 years to 8 in July, a quadrupling nearly of the number of protests that are taking place. And such is the anger of workers in the public sector that on top of the corruption, there has been a managerial attitude of ignoring the consequences of the pandemic, a failure to observe safety protocols for the workers, as a consequence of which there's been mounting anger within the working class. So deep that even the Class Collaborationist Trade Union Federation, the Congress of South African Trade Unions, that is in an alliance with the ANC and the South African Communist Party, has been compelled to call action. Now, we had, as the Marxist Workers' Party, in advance of these developments, called upon the South African Federation of Trade Unions at a meeting of the steering committee of the Working Class Summit to call a public sector general strike, which was penciled in for the 30th of April. The General Secretary of SAFTU was supposed to take that to the NEC for endorsement and for preparation. And mobilizations were going to take place in preparation for that public sector general strike on Sharpeville Day, the 21st of March. Unfortunately, the NEC of SAFTU was paralyzed by a factional struggle led by the president, the leader of the National Union of Metal Workers of South Africa. As a consequence, nothing has come out of that, and SAFTU has been in a state of virtual quarantine itself, as far as its responsibilities to the working class are concerned. And now, as we warned them in advance in an open letter, they were in danger of being outflanked by the Congress of South African Trade Unions itself, which SAFTU was created as an alternative to in the eyes of the workers who led the process of the establishment of the new federation. So now we are going to have action driven first of all by the Health Workers Union that is affiliated to the Congress of South African Trade Unions, beginning with protests on the 3rd of September. And then there will be further action, which is being called by COSATU itself. In these circumstances, the attempt on the part of the president of SAFTU to paralyze the new federation by attempting to postpone the meetings of the NEC until the end of COVID, whenever that might be, has provoked a reaction from the affiliates. And as a result, an NEC meeting has taken place where a program of action has been adopted, the details of which we still are awaiting. But we have an explosive development, not only in the workplace, but as a consequence of this crisis, a deepening of the factional civil war within the ANC itself. The ANC has just emerged from a National Executive Committee meeting that had been preceded by evidence that the truce between the factions that had been agreed when Ramaphosa was elected as the ANC president 2 years ago, had been called off. There were open calls for Ramaphosa to be removed as president. It appears, though, that he has come out of this particular NEC, having gained the upper hand slightly. But there is no way that the other faction can resign themselves to the successful implementation of the corruption drive. Ramaphosa's own credibility as a corruption buster is lying in tatters. And there's a growing desire on the part of the masses for a working class alternative. And that is the context in which we published our open letter and have called upon the leadership of SAFTU to reconvene the Working Class Summit that gathered in 2017, where 147 community organizations and trade unions came together and adopted a resolution for the establishment of a mass workers' party on a socialist program. We are proposing, and that is what we did in our open letter, that they, in the first instance, to mobilize for that event itself, should themselves call a public sector general strike. We were saying that they must demand the implementation of the wage agreement that the government has unilaterally terminated, and also demand the reinstatement of the extended public works employees who were dismissed in March, 3,000 of whom were dismissed in March, that we as the Marxist Workers' Party are working with, as well as employ permanently, not those workers alone, but all the community health workers in the country. The anger has been further inflamed by the fact that the attitude of the faction that is opposed to Ramaphosa are openly defending corruption. And Ramaphosa has his work cut out. Such are the tensions between the two factions. Ramaphosa cannot be seen to fail with his corruption drive, but the faction opposed to him cannot allow him to succeed. We are into very turbulent waters as far as the future of the ANC itself is concerned. And what we have warned about to the leadership of SAFTU in particular is that in the event that the working class does not translate its struggles in the workplace also onto the political plane through the formation of a mass workers' party, into that vacuum will step all sorts of reactionary forces. Just this past week, we have seen the launch of a political party called Action South Africa. This party is unashamedly xenophobic. It has elevated what was an unofficial policy of xenophobia in the ANC into a manifesto of the new party, coupled with open support for the idea of a free market economy, wanting to take the promises of the ANC of structural reform much further. That is to say, privatization, retrenchments, and so on and so forth, much further than even the ANC might have contemplated. And that is why this question is of such huge importance so far as the prospect of the struggle of the working class itself is concerned. We are confident that the call that we have made through our open letter will find fertile soil amongst the activists who have themselves come to the conclusion that the leadership is paralyzed. In the party that was created by the NUMSA leadership, for example, that performed so dismally in 2019, failing to get even one seat, there is now an open revolt against a party that was created in the name of the NUMSA members, but which was actually most politically significantly repudiated by the NUMSA workers themselves. And there's now a demand for a special national congress to be called to remove this leadership. So far as the political crisis in the country is concerned, in the main parties of capital, in the ANC, in the Democratic Alliance, and even in the economic freedom fighters, there's a growing crisis. And Ramaphosa's corruption drive will have no alternative but to tackle the leadership of the EFF as well. And therefore the task of the construction of a mass workers' party on a socialist program has never been more urgent. In the 2019 elections, for example, it was the first time since 2019 that the number of voters who went to the polls was lower than 50%. All the parties in parliament, in other words, collectively do not enjoy the support of the majority of the electorate. There are enormously favorable circumstances for a party of this character, given the response that we have received to the issues that we've raised in our open letter for such a party to come into existence.
Well, that's very full there, Wiseman, in terms of indicating the fragmentation and the crisis which exists. And you mentioned the open letters produced by the Marxist Workers' Party. And I'd just like to draw our viewers' attention to the fact that if you go to the CWI website, socialistworld.net, the open letters produced by the Marxist Workers' Party are there for you to read, along with other analysis by the CWI on the international situation and the situation that's developing in a whole series of countries. And of course, you can find our website there, as I say, at socialistworld.net. You can also follow us on Twitter at CWI Socialist. You can like our web page, our Facebook page, Socialist World-CWI, and you can follow us on Instagram at Socialist world. Now, I think Wiseman gave a very full explanation and really brought out the crisis which is unfolding, really within the ANC, but the battle that's taking place within the trade unions. Now, South Africa has a very strong trade union level of organisation, at least relative to other countries. I don't know, Wiseman, if there's any other points you'd like to develop about the battle that's taking place in the trade unions at this stage, and how the Marxist Workers' Party is approaching the question of building left opposition groups. What's the perspectives for the position between SAFTU and COSATU?
Yes, Comrade Tony. We took an initiative towards the end of last year to work together with the field slaves, if you like, of the public sector workers, those employed with no benefits, on wages that are lower than that even of the paltry minimum wage that was introduced by Ramaphosa, and organized protests, including a sit-in at the union buildings in February this year, which was supported by the General Secretary of the South African Federation of Trade Unions, and our ally in SAFTU, the National Union of Public Service and Allied Workers Union, who assisted in the mobilization, including assisting the EPWP workers by partially funding the buses that came to that particular demonstration. In alliance with NUPSO, we are now going to extend the campaign for permanent employment for the community health workers who won an important victory for permanent jobs in the province of Gauteng, for that to be replicated across the country. And on the basis of setting the example in practice, bring the other forces of SAFTU and the leadership itself into that struggle. Our approach is that SAFTU should support the action called by COSATU, but that they need to be very, very clear that the COSATU leadership, who incidentally supported amendments to the Labor Relations Act calculated to cripple the right to strike, are calling this action to diffuse the growing discontent of its own members. And SAFTU has an opportunity through this particular action, which they must correctly join. Anything else would be divisive and sectarian. But to rebuild the hopes and credibility that it had at the time that it was first brought into existence, particularly the action that was taken in a year after it had been established, with a general strike in April of 2018, followed, of course, by the Working Class Summit that took place in July of that year. And we are saying that, as the early COSATU understood, the struggle in the workplace cannot be separated from the political struggle. It cannot be separated from the struggles of the communities. And we have an opportunity here to bring together, to knit together, the enormous protests that are escalating in working class townships against poor service delivery, against corruption, together with the struggles of the students and with the struggles of the working class in the workplace. Although, of course, these ideas that we are putting forward are resonating with the rank and file, unfortunately, the leaders of NUMSA, the Deputy General Secretary, Karl Klute, has called for the Marxist Workers' Party to be banned. Now, that is the language of the apartheid regime. These have not yet entered into official resolutions, and it is unlikely that they will succeed, but gives a glimpse into the outlook of the leadership that created the Socialist Revolutionary Workers' Party behind the backs, not just of the SAFTU members, but behind the backs of the members of NUMSA as well. We believe there will be no alternative but to take the struggle beyond what the COSATU leadership have in mind and prepare through the public sector general strike, the climate for a general strike and the creation of a mass workers' party on a socialist program.
Oh, well, it's obviously a raging battle is in the process of unfolding in the very important and crucial centre of arena of struggle, and that's within the trade unions, within South Africa itself. Now, of course, South Africa is key for the whole region with its powerful revolutionary traditions and its strong working class. But of course, we have a different situation existing in different countries. And maybe Sean, who hopefully can join us from Joburg, will be able to outline some points on that. We have, for example, the question of Zimbabwe, which is obviously crucial, which has had a lot of international publicity. We've seen the end of the Mugabe era. But what is the current situation, Sean, in Zimbabwe, and has the situation improved or stabilised indeed at all after Mugabe's departure? Now, in bringing Sean in, we'd just like to inform our viewers, due to some technical problems in Johannesburg, there won't be a vision of Sean. It will just be an audio broadcast and response on his part. So Sean, maybe you could deal with some points in relation to Zimbabwe to start with.
Well, if anything, the situation in Zimbabwe is worse, or at least as bad as the worst days of Mugabe's rule. The country faces a catastrophic economic situation and a further collapse in already desperate living standards. Even before the pandemic, in the course of 2019, the Zimbabwean economy shrank by 6.5%. The World Bank is now predicting a further contraction of up to 10% in the course of 2020, although others, possibly more credible, are predicting a contraction of up to 20%. The country faces a currency crisis. There is 700% inflation, the last that we checked. The electricity is off in many parts of the country for up to 18 hours a day. There are hours-long queues to get petrol. The medicine is running out. Half of the population is described as food insecure, in other words, at risk of starvation. And under this pressure, we've seen ordinary people border jumping into South Africa just to buy food and medicine in the local shops close to the border. So the result of this situation is obviously seething discontent amongst the masses. There's been strike action by nurses and doctors, especially under the blows of the pandemic, worsening their already terrible situation of low pay or no pay for months at a time. And a national movement was beginning to coalesce. On the 31st of July, national protest action took place against the corruption in the regime presiding over this economic devastation. Now, the response of the president, Emmerson Mnangagwa, and the ruling ZANU-PF party in the run-up to these protests, during the protests and after them, was to oversee a political crackdown, as severe as anything that you would have seen under Mugabe. There have been arrests and reports of torture, of journalists, of opposition leaders, trade union activists, and human rights lawyers as well. Anyone, in fact, who has been critical of the government, even celebrities. Now, I'll just step back and remind viewers of the origins of the Mnangagwa regime. Now, we've already mentioned the coup in Mali and the new military regime there. Well, of course, the Mnangagwa regime came to power through a military coup as well, deposing Robert Mugabe in November 2017. And, well, who was Mnangagwa before he seized power? Was he at least a clean broom, coming in untainted by the regime? Well, no. He was the vice president under Mugabe. Before that, he was the state security minister. So he was a solid part of the military establishment for decades, close to the generals, the secret service, and so on. In other words, he had been Mugabe's henchman. Now, at the time of the coup, the South African government, the imperialist powers of Europe, the United States, but also powers like China and others, were all very cautious about calling Mnangagwa's takeover a coup. Now, why? Because really, the term coup is reserved for those transfers of political power that imperialism disapproves of. Now, in the case of the coup against Mugabe, it is almost certain that Mnangagwa had been given the green light by the imperialist powers, and the South African regime even. Now, amongst a section of the masses, such was the hatred of Mugabe, of course, and such were the levels of desperation after nearly 40 years of his rule that there were some illusions that things would be better now. Surely no one could be worse or as bad as Mugabe. Well, the first thing to say is, of course, we were very happy that Mugabe was gone. Of course we were. But we warned that Mugabe may be gone, but his regime remains in power. Now, reflecting and understanding of this, in the elections in 2018, a little over 7 months after Mnangagwa's coup, despite vote rigging, intimidation, Mnangagwa only scraped 50.8% of the presidential vote. He only scraped through. And things have moved on quickly since then. In 2017, in the run-up to the coup, the call was for Mugabe to go. Now the most popular hashtag is ZANU-PF must go. And hence, that explains the crackdown. Because Mnangagwa's is a weak regime that does not, in reality, rule with the consent of the people. But let's be clear on another point. Because any criticism and condemnation of Mnangagwa by the imperialist powers is really only a reflection of the frustration that Mnangagwa is not serving them up the sufficient appearance of a democratic or at least a stable regime that would allow them to normalise relations and continue profiting from Zimbabwe, something that was, if not impossible, at least more complicated under Mugabe's reign. But all of these governments want to keep the door open to Mnangagwa. I'll give an example from the region. South Africa, when the crackdown was reaching its height, sent high-level envoys to Zimbabwe to discuss, and I quote their mandate, to discuss the difficulties that Zim is experiencing. Well, difficulties, that's a euphemism for mass arrests, torture, disappearances, and presumably murder of at least several activists. Now, the envoys returned to South Africa without even having met the leadership of the main opposition party, whose members are one of the main targets of the regime. That party, by the way, offers no way forward for the working class and poor, but nevertheless they're victims of anti-democratic persecution. So clearly the envoys from South Africa were there to try and get Mnangagwa back on side, and they didn't want to do anything to upset him. Because you see, Mnangagwa is supposed to be their guy, a safer pair of hands for the ruling class regionally and from the point of view of imperialism. Now, just quickly, what do I mean by imperialism? It's worth just saying that for the viewers and the listeners. I mean those governments, former colonial powers in many cases, such as Britain, the former colonial power of Zimbabwe, those governments in Europe, America, but also now China and others, who are totally in hock to the interests of finance capital, the huge global banks, the multinationals and other big business interests. Mnangagwa and his regime are completely happy to serve those interests. Now, the first thing that Mnangagwa did as president before the 2018 elections, so in effect at the head of the junta, was to introduce new transaction taxes and a round of privatisations of the remaining state sector to try and raise $700 million to pay back debt arrears to the World Bank and the European Investment Bank. In other words, to squeeze the already desperate people of Zimbabwe on behalf of imperialism in an early gesture of goodwill. What did he do after that? Well, Mugabe had introduced a law that 51% of all mining interests must be locally owned, the indigenisation law. Viewers should be aware that Zimbabwe is a treasure trove. Over 40 different minerals can be mined in the country. This law, under Mugabe, was dressed up in nationalist rhetoric, but for him it was a self-serving effort to bolster the position of the weak Zimbabwean capitalist class and service patronage networks to maintain his rule. But imperialism hated it. But Mugabe had already fallen out with them. He had more to gain by implementing the indigenisation on the domestic stage than he had to lose on the international one. But Mnangagwa repealed this law as one of his first acts. Now, all the London Stock Exchange listed mining companies are signing new deals, North American companies and Chinese companies as well. The icing on the cake in Mnangagwa's policies from the point of view of imperialism is that just last month he agreed to pay $3.5 billion in compensation for Mugabe's land reforms of a decade ago. Now again, These were implemented from the point of view, first and foremost, of building domestic support for Mugabe, but we do have to admit that it broke the backs of the big agricultural capitalists. But now Mnangagwa is trying to resuscitate their corpse. The compensation has been paid to the white-only Zimbabwe Commercial Farmers Union, which represents the interests of big agribusiness in Zimbabwe, the breadbasket of southern Africa. So Mnangagwa is playing ball on all the vital interests of imperialism. But the sick and diseased character of Zimbabwean capitalism, heavily dependent on sick and diseased South African capitalism, both ultimately caught in the vice-like grip of imperialism, means that the ruling elite cannot deliver even the appearance of reforms that benefit the masses. Consequently, their rule is weak and fragile because, on the basis of the universal franchise, which is, of course was won in Zimbabwe like as in South Africa, Mozambique and other countries through mass struggle, they're unable to find a stable base of support within the mass of the population, and that is what gives the ruling elite its deeply anti-democratic character. And in turn, this is a contradiction for the support of imperialism, because it makes it almost impossible to sell their support for the Mnangagwa regime to the working class in South Africa, the region, or indeed the working class in the imperialist powers, who are all disgusted by these anti-democratic abuses. There's a lot more that could be said, but I'll have to stop there.
Well, thanks, Sean, for that explanation about Zimbabwe and what's going on in some of the other areas as well. But of course, we have an entirely different situation in Mozambique, where we're faced with an uprising of an Islamic insurgency taking place. So maybe you have a few comments to say about the situation there and why that has developed.
Well, on the surface, yes, it appears that there is a very different situation in Mozambique to, say, Zimbabwe and South Africa. But of course, there are very similar underlying causes to the disastrous situation facing that country. In the crisis of capitalism, now deepened by the pandemic, the weakness of the ruling elite, and the vice grip of imperialism on Mozambique. So, since 2017, in the northernmost province of Mozambique, Cabo Delgado, a new group has initiated a violent insurgency in which, so far, 1,000 are thought to have died and 250,000 been displaced. In recent months, this insurgency has been growing in sophistication. Last month, the port of Mocimboa de Praia was captured, revealing a new and growing access to weaponry, itself suggesting growing external influence on the movement. Now, I remind viewers that if you follow the African coast north from Mozambique, through first Tanzania, then Kenya, you reach Somalia, a virtual failed state in which the Islamic terrorist group Al-Shabaab has been operating for a whole period. Now, Al-Shabaab has been responsible over recent years for atrocities throughout the region, talking more about Eastern Africa now, including the horrific Garissa massacre in Kenya in 2015, where 150 university students were slaughtered in a brutal day of carnage. So what's going on? Is this spreading south? Well, in one sense, yes. In another, perhaps more important sense, no. The Mozambican insurgents, now they're being called Al-Shabaab by the locals, who are, in general opposed to them. But the movement has no proven links yet to Al-Shabaab in Somalia. What we seem to have is more like a copycat movement that now possibly is being hijacked by Al-Shabaab, and Islamic State has been mentioned as well. Or maybe even more accurately, you could say is being branded by these organisations. So a homegrown product with a multinational logo slapped on it for marketing purposes. Now, important things to understand about the situation is that Cabo Delgado is nearly 2,000 kilometres from the Mozambican capital of Maputo. I'm actually nearly 3 times closer to Maputo, speaking to you from Pretoria, than Cabo Delgado is. So the state is extremely distant, has little authority, barely exists, in fact. The area suffers from extreme economic underdevelopment. Now, the insurgency seems to be being driven by marginalised young people in the main, with little education, absolutely no job prospects. It seems the youth are mainly drawn from the minority and marginalised Muslim population, at about 20% in Cabo Delgado. And, this recalls the situation in Afghanistan in the 1990s, where amongst the local population, Taliban, for example, was also a euphemism for unemployed youth at that stage. Now, there is another absolutely key ingredient that is fueling this insurgency. In 2010, massive offshore gas and oil fields were discovered. Many of the big oil multinationals have begun developing these fields in the last few years. Total, Exxon, Shell, you name it, all the big players are there. And Mocimboa de Praia, the captured port, and the regularly attacked villages along the coast are the infrastructure hubs to reach these oil and gas fields, which sit directly off the coast. There's been huge frustration which has developed amongst the local population that the massive investment in these fields, $23 billion, more than the value of the entire Mozambican economy, has completely bypassed the local population. There's been no jobs, no development, despite the promises that have been made. Then, adding to this, has been the exposure of major corruption that has literally bankrupted the country. The Mozambique government, it's reliant on funding from so-called donor countries. Now, the entire GDP of Mozambique is not even $15 billion in a population of nearly 30 million. It's one of the poorest countries in the world. But the ruling elite, using the expected oil and gas revenues as collateral, borrowed $2 billion from Credit Suisse, a major Russian bank, and others, and then siphoned a huge portion of those borrowings off into their own pockets. As a result, Mozambique has been plunged into a major debt crisis. Again, even before the pandemic hit in 2018, Mozambique had to restructure its debt. This year, debt worth $900 million, remember, against the backdrop of an economy with a GDP of only 15 billion, has to pay back that 900 million, which has been charged at an interest rate of 9%. It's in a euro bond. This money is going back to Europe, it's going back to America, to the imperialist powers. So between the local elites and the imperialist so-called investors, creditors and donors, the people of Mozambique are being bled dry. In the run-up to last year's elections, marred, as in Zimbabwe, by massive corruption, it was reported that the youth were revolting against the ruling party. Well, tragically, in the rural north, in conditions of extreme underdevelopment, that revolt can take the form of an insurgency, guerrilla wars, which we're seeing, both of which, of course, are a dead end in reality. So the call for a caliphate in northern Mozambique is, in an extremely distorted way, a desperate attempt by a section of the marginalised youth in Cabo Delgado to take their destiny into their own hands. The reality is that the barbaric social conditions of extreme poverty and underdevelopment will create these phenomena which are barbaric in their own right, just as they have in the Sahel region around Mali, which we've mentioned. Can it spread? Well, yes. It is highly unlikely, I should say, that it could ever take hold in South Africa, a highly urbanised society with the minority Muslim population occupying a different social position to the Muslim minority in Mozambique. But you can't rule out terrorist atrocities developing, especially if, as is the case already, South Africa becomes more involved in the conflict through the deployment of troops, which is being discussed. I mean, already special forces are on the ground and South African mercenaries. But in other parts of Mozambique, Tanzania, Kenya, the social conditions do exist for a belt of instability to develop, comparable to the Sahel region. Now, I'll just finish by making this one point. We recently celebrated the life of Leon Trotsky on the anniversary of his assassination. We celebrated in his ideas the centrality of internationalism and the fundamental fact that the struggle for socialism can only be approached as a worldwide task. Now, the question of the socialist revolution in any of the underdeveloped countries of southern Africa is immediately posed as a regional question. Now, the role of imperialism in the region then, very quickly, poses the stark necessity of its worldwide character to any worker or young person that considers it. Now, for the working class and poor masses of the southern African region, the world socialist revolution is the only way out of the nightmare of capitalism. This requires the unity of the working class and poor masses in the region, the continent, linking up with the working class in the imperialist countries to unite in struggle against capitalism on a world scale.
Okay, well, thanks for that, Sean. You've given a very clear illustration there and emphasised in conclusion, of course, the need for the unity of the working class and the question of the socialist revolution. So we've had an extremely thorough and in-depth analysis and comments by the comrades, I think, of these crucial developments, at least in this part of Africa as well. And maybe briefly in conclusion, maybe Bob in London would like to sum up the position and maybe underline any points which need to be stressed as far as what programme and tasks is necessary to assist the workers in Africa in general in facing up to the challenges of the crisis that capitalism is thrusting on their backs.
I think that both Wiseman and Sean have given really the two sides of the issues of the dilemma or the choices which are faced. Sean just now, in describing how this insurgency has developed in Mozambique, obviously spoke about the particular issues in that country. But we see throughout Africa and also in other parts of the world, a situation where you have dire social crisis, a feeling of opposition to the ruling elite, to the ruling regimes, a desire for change. And if there is no clear position, if there is no clear alternative put forward by the workers' movement, then you can have these sort of this explosive situation developing, like in northern Mozambique, of different types of insurgencies, of different types of conflicts, which we have seen in different parts of the world, and we are seeing in different parts of the world, where sometimes, without a lead from the workers' movement, countries can actually break up. Something that we've seen in the past, tendencies towards in Central Africa, we've seen it in East Africa, in parts of West Africa, and obviously currently in, say, in Libya, in North Africa. And the alternative to that is a clear, not just clear program, but clear example which is set by the workers' movement, struggling on both the immediate issues, but also to change society. That is the question which Wiseman, I think, illustrated from the experience of South Africa. Obviously, in South Africa, the strength of the trade unions, of the workers' movement, is really the strongest in the whole continent. And the debates, the political debates, the debates on which way forward in South Africa are, to a certain extent, mirrored in other countries as well. It's not just in South Africa that we see the trade union leaderships trying to use the pandemic as an excuse for shutting down debate inside the trade union, of trying to just achieve agreements with the governments, of refusing to concretely struggle. It's something which we see in Africa, but also in other continents as well. And in this situation, the struggle, if you like, to link together the movements on the immediate issues with the idea of an alternative, of what is the way forward, is key. And that means challenging the base of capitalism, showing not just in Africa, with all the continent's riches, both in terms of raw materials, but also human potential, what could actually be done. But it also applies, as I've said before, in other continents as well. And therefore, if you like, struggle to build a socialist alternative, to build a workers' movement, but that movement to also involve the other sections of society, the poor, to organize in the workplaces and in the communities, is absolutely key, because that is the only way forward. It's clear that capitalism cannot give a harmonious development. As Sean just said now, if we look at the pioneering role of Trotsky in looking at what should be the task of the workers' movements in the less developed capitalist countries, that still applies today, the need to break with capitalism and to establish an alternative. And that really is the question which is posed, because the alternative is not just chaos, but also the poverty and the danger of the sectarian warfare, the breakups, which we've seen in other parts of the world, which we've seen in Europe, in the Balkans 20 or more years ago, which we've seen in parts of the Middle East. Those are the threats which are posed unless we can actually help to build a working class alternative.
Well, thanks, Bob, and thanks for Wiseman and Sean for joining us today. I'd just like to remind you that you can find more of the analysis of the Committee for Workers International if you visit our website at socialistworld.net. We published a book recently commemorating the anniversary of the assassination of Leon Trotsky, which I think readers will find very interesting in terms of clarifying some of Trotsky's ideas and how they're relevant to today's situation. And that book is Leon Trotsky, The Ideas They Couldn't Kill, which should be coming up for that now. And you can get details of how to order that from our website at socialistworld.net. And I'd just like to appeal to you once again, don't be passive, get active in the struggle. Join us in the Committee for Workers International in the battle to build a real socialist alternative to the horrors that capitalism is placing on the backs of the mass of the population of this planet at this particular stage. We'd appeal to you again to go to our CWI media channel on YouTube, to subscribe to it, to help build our profile. Now, as you know, these broadcasts have largely have taken place almost exclusively on a Tuesday during the course of the pandemic, because of the fact that many workers are now going back to work, universities are opening. We will no longer be broadcasting on a Tuesday, but we'll be switching our broadcasts to a Sunday afternoon at 3:00 London time on a Sunday afternoon. That's not this Sunday coming, but a week on Sunday. So look out for the promotions for the future broadcasts. We need your support, not just to join us in the struggle, but financially. And if you'd like to go to our Patreon, which will come up on the screen below, you'll see details of how you can support us financially. You can, of course, go to our website, socialistworld.net, and make a one-off donation there. But nevertheless, I'd like to thank you for joining us today, and we'll look forward to seeing you a week on Sunday for further analysis of the global crisis and how it is impacting on the working class of the world and what a socialist alternative is. So thanks again for watching. Stay safe, join the struggle, and join us in the CWI.